There is a strange fact about you that you have probably never once stopped to consider. Every single day, you eat food that has been changed by fire before it ever touches your mouth. Not occasionally, not as a treat, as a baseline requirement. No other animal on this planet does that. Not chimpanzees, not gorillas, not wolves, not crows, not dolphins. Every other creature on Earth eats its food in the same chemical state that nature made it. Humans are the only species that systematically destroys its food with heat and then calls that meal. That should strike you as odd. Cooking takes time. It takes fuel. It takes planning. It takes standing near something that can burn you alive if you get too close. From a survival standpoint, none of that seems worth the trouble. And yet somewhere in our deep past, a creature that was not yet fully human looked at raw meat, or a raw root, or a raw seed, and decided that putting it into fire was worth the risk. That decision, made by some nameless ancestor hundreds of thousands of years ago, did not just change what was for dinner. Many researchers now think it changed the shape of our skulls, the size of our guts, the structure of our teeth, the rhythm of our days, and quite possibly the size of our brains. Cooking may be the single habit that made us human in the first place. Now let us actually think about what that means. To understand why cooking mattered so much, you first have to understand what life was like before it existed. Picture an early hominin, one of our ancestral cousins, walking the grasslands of eastern Africa around 2 million years ago. This creature is not a modern human. It is smaller-brained, more muscular in the jaw, and it eats the way every other primate eats. Raw. Whatever it finds, whatever it can chew, whatever it can digest without any preparation at all. That diet sounds simple, but it comes with a brutal cost. Raw food, especially raw meat and raw starchy plants, is hard work for a digestive system. Muscle fibers in raw meat are tough and bound together by connective tissue that resists being broken down. Raw plant tissue is often protected by rigid cell walls made of cellulose, a material your stomach acids and enzymes are simply not built to dissolve efficiently. So an early hominin eating raw food had to chew for hours every single day just to get enough calories to survive. Chimpanzees today, who still eat mostly raw food, spend around 6 hours a day chewing. 6 hours! Imagine spending a quarter of your waking life with your jaw working non-stop just to extract enough energy to stay alive. And even after all that chewing, the body still could not extract everything the food contained. Raw starches are locked inside plant cells that resist digestion. Raw proteins are wound into tight structures that digestive enzymes struggle to unfold and access. So a huge percentage of the calories in a raw meal simply pass through the body undigested. The gut worked overtime and still left nutrition on the table, so to speak. This created a hard ceiling. There is only so much energy available in a day. If most of that energy has to be spent chewing and digesting, there is very little left over for anything else. And here's where things get interesting, because the brain is one of the most expensive organs in the entire body. Pound for pound, it burns far more energy than muscle does, even when you're just sitting still doing nothing. A brain that wants to grow bigger eats a much larger, steadier supply of calories to fund that growth. So for millions of years, our ancestors were caught in a kind of energy trap. Bigger brains would have been useful for solving problems, but bigger brains needed more fuel, and raw food simply could not deliver that fuel efficiently enough. Something had to break that trap, and the leading explanation, developed most famously by the primatologist Richard Wrangham, is that fire broke it. Here's the logic behind that idea, step by step. Heat physically changes food before it ever reaches your stomach. When meat is heated, the connective tissue and muscle fibers loosen and partially break apart, which is why cooked meat is so much easier to tear and chew than raw meat. When starchy plants like tubers and roots are heated, their tough cell walls rupture, releasing the starch trapped inside, so your digestive enzymes can reach it directly. In effect, cooking does a huge portion of the digestive work before food even enters your mouth. It's like pre-chewing and pre-digesting your meal using fire instead of your own body. That might sound like a small convenience. It was not small. Studies comparing raw and cooked versions of the same foods show that cooking can increase the net calories the body actually absorbs by a significant margin, sometimes turning a meal that yields relatively little usable energy raw into one that yields dramatically more once cooked. Multiply that difference across every meal, every day, for generations, and you get a completely different energy budget for the body to work with. So picture what that means for an early hominin population that gained access to cooked food. Suddenly, less time needs to be spent chewing. Suddenly, more net calories are coming in from the same amount of food gathered. That surplus of energy and time has to go somewhere. Wrangham's hypothesis is that a meaningful portion of it went towards funding a bigger, hungrier brain, while another portion went towards smaller jaws, smaller teeth, and a smaller gut, since a body that no longer needs to process large amounts of raw material doesn't need such an oversized digestive system to do it. Before we get to the fossils themselves, it helps to understand exactly which ancestor we're even talking about, because human evolution was not a straight line with one creature turning into the next in tidy order. It was a messy, branching bush with several hominin species sometimes living at the same time in the same regions, competing for the same resources. The species most closely associated with the early stages of this story is Homo erectus, which appeared in Africa around 2 million years ago and eventually spread across Asia and parts of Europe. Homo erectus looked strikingly different from the hominins that came before it. It had a body built for long-distance walking and running, a smaller gut, and, notably, a brain considerably larger than its predecessors. If the cooking hypothesis is correct, Homo erectus is exactly the species you'd expect to see benefiting from an early, if inconsistent, relationship with fire. Here's where the fossil record gets genuinely interesting. If cooking really did reshape our ancestors, you'd expect to see it written into their bones, and to some extent, you do. Compared to earlier hominins, the species that anthropologists place around the time cooking may have become important shows smaller molars, a smaller jaw, and skeletal evidence suggesting a much smaller gut cavity relative to body size. None of this proves cooking was the cause on its own. Bodies changed for many reasons. But the pattern lines up with what you'd expect if a species had shifted from a diet requiring heavy raw digestion to one supported by pre-processed, calorie-dense food.
Now here is where honesty about the evidence matters, because this is a genuinely debated area of science, not a settled fact. The hardest part of testing this idea is finding direct proof that fire was being controlled and used for cooking that far back in time. Fire leaves faint traces. Ash blows away. Charcoal decomposes. A campfire from 1 million years ago does not usually leave a convenient, unmistakable signature sitting in the dirt waiting to be found. Still, archaeologists have found some remarkable clues. At a site called Wonderwerk Cave in South Africa, researchers discovered burned bone fragments and ashed plant remains deep inside the cave, far from the entrance, in a layer dated to roughly 1 million years ago. Being that far inside a cave matters because it makes it far less likely the burning happened naturally from something like a wildfire sweeping through, since wildfires don't typically creep deep into a cave interior. That pattern is more consistent with a controlled fire, deliberately carried or maintained by hominins living or sheltering there. At Gesher Benot Ya'aqov in Israel, archaeologists uncovered clusters of burned flint and wood in localized patches dated to around 790,000 years ago. The fact that the burned material was clustered rather than scattered randomly across the whole site again suggests a hearth, a specific, maintained fire location, rather than the random aftermath of a natural blaze. And in China, at the site of Zhoukoudian and long associated with Homo erectus, researchers found layers containing ash, charred bone, and burned stone tools. For years, this site was held up as some of the clearest early evidence of fire use, although later, more careful analysis raised questions about how much of that material was truly the product of controlled fire versus natural burning processes. That back and forth is worth mentioning because it shows you how science on this topic actually works. Evidence gets found, evidence gets challenged, methods improve, and the picture gets refined rather than simply accepted at face value. What most researchers today agree on, even amid this debate, is that habitual, reliable, everyday use of fire, the kind you would need to cook food as a normal part of daily life, seems to become clearly and consistently visible in the archaeological record by around 400,000 years ago, with earlier and more sporadic use likely stretching back much further, possibly beyond 1 million years. So there is a real difference between the earliest hints of fire use and the point in which fire became a dependable daily tool. Cooking as an occasional experiment probably came first. Cooking as a way of life came later. There's a good reason this evidence is so hard to pin down, and it says something about how difficult it is to reconstruct any part of deep human history. A campfire from 1,000,000 years ago was built by creatures with no concept of leaving a record for the future. They were not trying to prove anything to anyone. They were trying to eat dinner and stay warm. So the traces they left behind are faint almost by definition. A smear of ash here, a scattering of cracked stone there, easily disturbed by 1,000,000 years of rain, wind, shifting soil, and burrowing animals. Every confirmed hearth that survives long enough for a modern archaeologist to find and correctly interpret represents an enormous stroke of preservation luck. For every one hearth that survives, there were almost certainly countless others that simply did not. So why does any of this matter beyond satisfying curiosity about old bones and ash layers? Let's pause here and think about what this reveals. It reveals something important about how evolution actually works. We tend to imagine evolution as this slow, passive process where creatures simply adapt to whatever environment they happen to be born into. But the story of cooking suggests something more active. A behavior, a habit, something a creature chooses to do can reshape the pressures acting on its own body. Once some early hominins started reliably using fire to process food, natural selection was no longer just responding to the raw physical environment. It was responding to a new, invented environment that hominins had partly created themselves. Smaller jaws were no longer a disadvantage once tough chewing was outsourced to fire. Bigger brains were no longer an unaffordable luxury once more calories were coming in for the same effort. In other words, our ancestors did not simply evolve and then discover fire as a lucky bonus. It looks more like fire and evolution were pulling on each other back and forth, each one making the next step in the other possible. That is a genuinely different way of thinking about what makes a species successful. Success is not only about withstanding your environment. Sometimes it is about changing what your environment demands of you in the first place. Now, let's return to the humans themselves and ask a very practical question. How would a creature without any concept of chemistry, without any understanding of nutrition, without any of the knowledge we now have, ever stumble onto the idea of cooking in the first place? The most likely starting point was not intention, it was opportunity. Wildfires happen naturally, sparked by lightning strikes across dry grassland and forest. After a wildfire swept through an area, animals caught in the blaze would sometimes be left behind, already cooked by the heat of the fire. Early hominin scavenging through burned landscapes after a fire had passed would have had the chance to eat meat that had been unintentionally cooked. And that meat would have been easier to tear apart, easier to chew, and quite possibly simply more appealing in taste and smell than raw meat, since cooking triggers a chemical process called the Maillard reaction, where proteins and sugars in food interact under heat to create the rich, savory aromas and flavors we now associate with roasted and browned food. That smell is not an accident of modern cooking. It is one of the oldest food signals in existence. And it may have been drawing hungry scavengers toward burned carcasses for a very long time before anyone ever intentionally lit a flame to cook something. So the very first cooked meals our ancestors ever tasted were probably not cooked by them at all. They were gifts of accidental wildfire discovered by scavenging. And that alone raises an obvious next question. If accidentally cooked meat tasted better and was easier to eat, what would it take for a creature to go from simply taking advantage of that accident to deliberately recreating it? This is where the ability to control fire becomes the real turning point, and it likely happened in stages rather than all at once. The first stage was probably simply keeping a naturally occurring fire alive. If lightning sparked a fire near a hominin group, and that group had the sense to protect and feed that flame with fuel rather than letting it burn out, they would have possessed usable fire without ever needing to know how to create it from scratch. Tending an existing flame is a much smaller cognitive leap than inventing fire creation technology, since it mostly requires understanding that fire needs fuel, and that it can be moved carefully from one place to another using a burning branch or ember. The second stage, true firemaking, using tools like friction from spun wood or sparks struck from certain stones, likely came much later and required a level of technical understanding and patience that suggests a more advanced cognitive capacity. Evidence for reliable, on-demand fire starting, as opposed to simply keeping natural fire going, becomes much clearer in the archaeological record from roughly 100,000 years ago onward, although again, earlier and more limited use likely occurred before that. Once a group had reliable access to fire, whether tended from a natural source or created on demand, the transition to warming themselves and scaring off predators to actually cooking food would have happened quickly, almost inevitably. If you already know that meat left near fire becomes easier to eat and tastes better, it takes very little imagination to start placing meat near the fire on purpose.
The real innovation was never the idea of cooking itself. The real innovation was gaining consistent control over the tool that made cooking possible. It is worth pausing on that Maillard reaction for a moment, because it plays a bigger role in the story than a passing mention suggests. When heat hits the surface of meat or bread or roasted vegetables, sugars and amino acids on the surface break apart and recombine into hundreds of new flavor and aroma compounds that simply do not exist in the raw ingredient. That browning, that deep savory smell drifting off a roast, is not decoration added on top of food. It is an entirely new chemical signature created by heat alone. And that matters for the story because taste and smell are not just about pleasure. They are ancient survival signals shaped by evolution to draw animals toward foods that are calorie-dense and nutritionally rewarding. A creature with no understanding of chemistry didn't need to understand the Maillard reaction to be pulled toward its results. It only needed a nose and an appetite. In that sense, flavor itself may have acted as one of the very first teachers, quietly training early hominins to seek out and recreate the conditions that produced it. Let's pause here again, because this next point connects biology to something deeply personal about how we live today. Fire did not just change digestion, it very likely changed the structure of the human day and the structure of human society. Think about what a campfire actually requires and creates. It requires a stable location to build it. It requires people to gather around it for warmth, for light, and for protection from nighttime predators. And once people are gathered together, sitting still, with nothing physically demanding to do while food cooks, something else becomes possible that was much harder to do while foraging or fleeing through open grassland during the day: talking.
Some researchers argue that the campfire became one of the first reliable social spaces in human history, a predictable time and place where a group came together every single day, not to work, but to wait, eat, and interact. Anthropological studies of modern hunter-gatherer societies, such as work among the Zhoukoudian of the Kalahari, have found that daytime conversation among these groups tends to focus heavily on practical matters, complaints, and disputes, while nighttime conversation around the fire shifts dramatically towards storytelling, myth, social bonding, and shared cultural knowledge. If ancient fireside gatherings functioned anything like this, then the simple act of cooking dinner may have created the very first recurring stage for human culture itself, the place where lessons were passed down, where relationships were strengthened, and where shared identity as a group was reinforced night after night. There is also a practical, logistical side to fireside life that's easy to overlook, and it involves the emergence of cooperation in a very specific form. Cooking food takes time, sometimes a fairly long stretch of time, during which someone has to tend the fire, watch the food, and resist the urge to simply grab it raw and eat it immediately. That delay creates an interesting social problem. If food is being prepared for a group rather than consumed the instant it is caught or gathered, then trust becomes necessary. The person tending the fire has to trust that others will not simply steal the meal once it finishes cooking, and the group has to trust that whoever controls the fire will actually share what comes off it rather than hoarding it. Some anthropologists argue that cooking, by introducing this built-in waiting period between acquiring food and eating it, may have pushed early human groups toward more structured systems of sharing, reciprocity, and fairness, since a group that could not cooperate around a shared cooking fire would likely fracture into conflict every single evening. If that is true, then something as ordinary as waiting for dinner to finish may have quietly trained early humans in one of the most foundational skills any society needs: the ability to delay a reward and trust that it will still be there, fairly divided when the waiting is over. There is also a quieter, more biological piece of this puzzle worth mentioning. Digesting raw food takes a great deal of energy and often continues well after a meal has ended. Cooked food, being easier to digest, likely freed up more consistent blocks of rest, including nighttime sleep. Some researchers have proposed that more reliable, uninterrupted sleep, enabled partly by both fire's protective glow, keeping predators away, and cooked food requiring less overnight digestive effort, may have supported the kind of memory consolidation and cognitive processing that a larger, more complex brain would benefit from. This is a more speculative thread in the research, worth mentioning honestly as an area still being explored, but it fits naturally into the larger pattern. Once fire entered the picture, almost every part of daily hominin life, eating, resting, socializing, teaching, had the potential to shift. There is one more critical piece of this story that is easy to overlook because it has nothing to do with taste or brain size at all.
It has to do with survival in a much more direct sense. Cooking kills things. Heat destroys a huge range of dangerous bacteria, parasites, and pathogens that commonly live in raw meat and contaminated plant material. Anyone who has ever gotten violently sick from undercooked meat in the modern world has experienced a small taste of a threat that would have been a constant, serious danger to an ancestor eating raw meat regularly with no medicine, no refrigeration, and no understanding of microbiology whatsoever. For an early hominin, a group that regularly cooked its meat rather than eating it raw would have faced meaningfully lower rates of foodborne illness and parasitic infection. Over generations, in a world where a single bout of severe food poisoning could easily be fatal, especially for children or nursing mothers, that reduced risk would have added up to a real survival advantage. Cooking was not only making food more nutritious, it was making food safer. So now, put both of these together. On one side, you have a raw food lifestyle. Hours of exhausting daily chewing, a large portion of the calories in each meal passing through the body unused, a digestive system that has to be oversized and constantly working just to keep up, a near total energy ceiling that leaves very little surplus for anything beyond basic survival, and a constant quiet risk of illness from parasites and bacteria living in untreated food. On the other side, you have a cooked food lifestyle. Meat and starchy plants broken down before they even reach the mouth. Chewing time cut dramatically. A much higher percentage of available calories actually absorbed by the body. A smaller, more efficient gut that costs less energy to maintain. A real, reliable calorie surplus available for other uses. Reduced risk of foodborne illness. Predictable daily gathering points that support social bonding, teaching, and the passing down of knowledge. And potentially more consistent restorative sleep. When you place these two lifestyles side by side like that, the outcome stops looking mysterious. It looks almost inevitable. Any hominin population that gained reliable access to cooking would have had a substantial edge over populations that did not, in terms of health, in terms of available energy, and quite possibly in terms of long-term brain development. That edge would not need to be dramatic in any single generation to matter. Small, consistent advantages repeated across tens of thousands of years and countless generations are exactly the kind of thing natural selection responds to. This helps explain something that puzzled scientists for a long time, which is the sheer size of the human brain relative to body size compared to almost every other animal on Earth. The human brain uses a strikingly large share of the body's total resting energy, despite making up a relatively small percentage of total body weight. That is an extraordinarily expensive organ to carry around and keep running. Something had to be paying that bill. Cooking, by delivering more usable calories from the same amount of food with less physical effort spent extracting them, is one of the most plausible explanations scientists have for how our ancestors could actually afford that bill. There is a useful comparison here that puts the size of this energy shift into perspective. Great apes, such as gorillas, which eat an almost entirely raw, plant-heavy diet, need enormous guts to process all that tough, fibrous material, and they spend the majority of their waking hours doing nothing but feeding. Humans, by contrast, have guts roughly 60% smaller than would be expected for a primate of our body size, and we spend a comparatively tiny fraction of our day actually eating. That difference has to be explained by something. A smaller gut is cheaper to maintain, but it can only afford to shrink if the food coming into it requires less raw processing power to extract its nutrients, which is exactly what cooked food provides. So when researchers point to human gut size as a piece of evidence for the cooking hypothesis, this is the underlying logic. Our internal anatomy looks like the anatomy of an animal that stopped relying on its own body to do all the digestive work. It's worth being honest here that not every scientist agrees on exactly how large a role cooking played compared to other factors, such as increased meat eating in general, changes in hunting technology, shifts in climate, or complex social cooperation, which all likely also contributed to brain growth over time. Science rarely credits any single cause for something as complex as the evolution of human intelligence.
But among the competing explanations, the cooking hypothesis has earned serious, sustained attention because it explains so many different pieces of evidence at once. The smaller teeth, the smaller gut, the brain growth, the changed daily rhythms. And it does so using a mechanism, more usable energy from less effort, that is simple, measurable, and consistent with basic biology. Once cooking became embedded in hominin life, it did not stay still. It kept evolving, spreading, and diversifying, and it eventually became something much larger than a mere survival tool. By the time we reached Neanderthals, a close relative species living across Europe and parts of Asia until around 40,000 years ago, there is strong archaeological evidence that cooking had become a sophisticated, established practice rather than a novelty. Excavated Neanderthal sites contain hearths, charred plant remains including roasted starchy tubers and legumes, and burned animal bones showing clear signs of controlled cooking rather than accidental burning. Chemical analysis of dental plaque preserved on Neanderthal teeth found at sites in Belgium and Iraq has even revealed traces of cooked starch granules, meaning scientists can look directly at what individual Neanderthals ate and confirm that some of their plant food had been heated before eating. This tells us cooking was not unique to our own direct lineage. It was likely already a shared trait among multiple hominin species by this point in time, further supporting the idea that fire use stretches back much further than the origin of modern humans specifically. As anatomically modern humans, our own species, spread out of Africa and across the globe over the last 100,000 years or so, cooking traveled with them everywhere, adapting constantly to local environments. In colder regions, fire became essential not just for food, but for basic survival against harsh temperatures, and cooking methods developed around fish and shellfish, foods that spoil rapidly and particularly benefit from the safety advantages that heat provides. Across different continents, entirely separate cooking traditions developed independently, using earth ovens dug into the ground and lined with heated stones, using clay pots once pottery technology emerged later, and using simple open flame roasting, each solution shaped by locally available materials, fuel sources, and food types. Pottery deserves special mention here because it represents an entire second revolution built directly on top of the first. Cooking with fire alone, on an open flame or in a simple earth oven works well for meat and for many plants, but it has limits. Once early humans, beginning roughly 20,000 years ago in parts of East Asia and spreading widely from there over subsequent millennia, learned to fire clay into hard, heat-proof containers, an entirely new category of cooking became possible. Boiling, stewing, simmering food slowly in liquid for hours at a time. Pottery meant that tough grains, dried legumes, and bones full of marrow and nutrients could be broken down in ways that direct flame alone could never accomplish. Some anthropologists argue that this second wave of cooking technology was just as transformative as the first because it unlocked entirely new food sources, particularly grains, that would go on to support the rise of agriculture and eventually permanent settlements and cities. In other words, the earliest campfire and the humble cooking pot are separated by hundreds of thousands of years, yet they are part of the exact same continuous story, each one expanding what heat could do to food. What stayed constant across every one of these wildly different environments was the underlying principle. Heat transforms food, making it safer, easier to digest, and often more flavorful. That single, simple insight, first stumbled upon by scavenging a lucky wildfire kill hundreds of thousands of years ago, eventually became the foundation for every cuisine that has ever existed on Earth. Every spice blend, every regional specialty, every family recipe passed down through generations across every culture in human history rests on that same ancient principle discovered by creatures who did not yet even fully resemble modern humans. Let's take a moment now to step back and consider what this entire story actually reveals, because it goes well beyond the history of food itself. It reveals that some of the most profound turning points in human history were not grand, dramatic events. They were small, almost accidental discoveries made by creatures who had no idea what they were setting in motion. No early hominin scavenging a burned carcass after a wildfire was thinking about brain evolution or the future of human civilization. They were simply hungry, and they noticed that this particular meat was easier to eat than usual. That is all it took to begin a chain of events that would eventually reshape the human body, the human brain, the structure of human society, and the trajectory of the entire species. It also reveals something meaningful about the relationship between biology and behavior. We often think of our bodies as fixed, and our habits as simply adapting to fit whatever body evolution gave us, but cooking flips that relationship on its head. A behavior, a habit passed down and practiced consistently across generations appears to have been powerful enough to reshape the very biology of the species practicing it. Our jaws got smaller because we stopped needing them to do as much work. Our guts got smaller because we started outsourcing digestion to fire. Our brains quite possibly got larger because a behavioral choice, protecting and using flame, freed up the energy needed to build and run them. In a very real sense, we did not simply evolve and then start cooking. We may have partly cooked ourselves into becoming who we are. There is one more layer to this story worth adding before we close, because it touches on something almost philosophical about what cooking really is. Every other survival adaptation in the animal kingdom happens inside the body. A longer digestive tract, a stronger stomach acid, specialized gut bacteria. These are all internal solutions built by evolution over countless generations to the same basic problem every creature faces: extracting enough energy from food to survive. Cooking solved that same problem in a completely different way. Instead of evolving a better internal system to break down tough raw food, humans essentially built an external digestive process, one that exists outside the body entirely, in the form of a fire. In a very real sense, humans offloaded a piece of their own biology onto a tool. That may be one of the earliest examples in the history of life on Earth of a species using technology to do a job that biology alone could not do efficiently. Every piece of technology that came afterward, agriculture, writing, medicine, all the way up to the modern world, arguably follows that same basic pattern, taking some problem that biology handles poorly on its own and building an external solution to handle it instead. Cooking may be the very first version of that idea, tested by creatures who had no words for invention or technology, but who had discovered, quite by accident, that the world outside the body could be reshaped to make life easier. And there is one final thought worth sitting with as we close the story. Every time you turn on a stove, every time you roast something in an oven, every time you stand near a barbecue grill with people you care about, you are participating in one of the oldest, most continuous behaviors in the entire human story. It began, most likely, with a hungry, half-human creature standing at the edge of a smoldering, burned landscape, staring at a piece of meat that smelled different than anything it had encountered before. It did not know what fire was chemically. It did not understand digestion or calories or evolution. It simply took a chance on something unfamiliar, and something about that risk paid off well enough to be tried again, and then passed down generation after generation for hundreds of thousands of years, until it became so deeply woven into what it means to be human that we rarely stop to think about it at all. The next time you smell food cooking, you are catching a faint trace of the exact same instinct that helped build the human brain in the first place.